Good evening. I'm Chuck Rybak, and thank you for joining us for our third episode of No Reservations, a conversation series designed to provide a forum for sharing bold, challenging, and provocative ideas. We are coming to you live once again from UW Green Bay's Fort Howard Hall at the Weidner Center for the Performing Arts. So thank you to the staff of the Weidner Center for hosting us in this beautiful space. We really appreciate it. Dr. Sawa Senzaki is an associate professor of psychology and has her PhD in social and cultural psychology from the University of Alberta. Her research focuses on the mutual construction between socio-cultural contexts and human cognition, and she is specifically interested in studying the process through which social and cultural contexts shape the perceptions, cognitions, and evaluations that drive social behavior and cognition. Dr. Jason Cowell is an associate professor of psychology and has his PhD in developmental social cognitive neuroscience from the University of Minnesota. He teaches courses about cognition and neuroscience and directs the Neuroscience Lab, where students study the development of social inputs to empathy, morality, and self-control in the brain. Professors Senzaki and Cowell will give a brief talk titled Emotion or Action: Cultural Differences in Parental Socialization of the Moral Brain. And then we will move to the question and answer portion. So please, if you're out there watching, post any questions that you have in the chat, and those will get relayed to me, and I will work as many of those in as I can. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Drs. Sawa Senzaki and Jason Cowell.
So thank you, Chuck, and thank you to the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for giving us an opportunity to start by introducing you to some of the big picture concepts that we'd love to talk about today, to get into a bit of our project. So I'll start by talking about morality, but we really appreciate the opportunity to get into a larger forum to talk about this. So morality is a word and concept that's used so frequently, but it seems to mean so many different things. It certainly includes aspects like fairness, justice, harm, and may even have to do with rights and laws or policies from a legal side. Looking around our everyday lives, we observe small cues like the fist, or this child in distress, or the broken glass, and it leads us to questions. It leads us to questions like, what happened? Are they okay? Do I need to do something here? What actually happened in this situation, and was it good or bad? The study of morality has largely been the investigations of philosophers for the last several millennia, with a focus on what we should do. Over the past half century, and particularly in the last 2 decades, psychologists and neuroscientists have flocked to this investigation of a critical element of humans. However, the nature of the questions has changed from what should we do to what do we do. So I'll start by having you think through an example. So take, for instance, this picture of a hand in obvious pain. Well, some of you look at this and you're feeling that fluttering feeling in your stomach, those butterflies. Some of you are taking the perspective of the individual and trying to figure out how much pain they're in. Some might be feeling concern for the person, and likely many of you are feeling some combination of all three. Put simply, observable signs of harm activate a series of social cognitions that relate to our evaluations of the scene. We've no idea why the person was hurt, if it was caused by another person, if it was accidental or intentional. What we're recognizing in viewing this picture is the various aspects of empathy and sympathy, from taking perspectives to understanding our own physiological feelings to having concern for the plight of others. Some of these are argued to be critical in constructing later moral judgment. Let's try another example. So if I show you this 3-picture sequence, you likely have a gut reaction about the rightness or wrongness of that action. The gut reaction has been a key element of moral psychological studies for over a decade. People come to quick and intuitive judgments about observed actions. However, that's not the whole story. You'll find yourself beginning to integrate many of those empathic concepts I just mentioned, then ascertaining the intentionality of the action, and all of these are going to play into your explicit judgment, the one that you can talk about and the one that you justify later to others. So that leads us to think that in adults, at least, we have a moral brain. We have a series of areas that are going to consistently relate to moral judgment. The thing is, there isn't a single area that is the moral brain. There's a lot of different areas that have to do with more general processing. That includes emotion processing areas, perspective-taking areas, self-regulation areas. These construct themselves into what we think of as moral judgment. But this is by adulthood. We know that the integration of these systems towards moral cognition takes years, even decades, and must be influenced by the experiences that the child has, by some aspects of genetics, and very likely by parents and the lessons that we are taught. So this is where I began the studies of the child's moral brain, and I did this as part of my postdoc with Dr. Jean Decidi, where we started with the first basic question, which was in preschoolers, do they also show that gut reaction and a later cognitively controlled reaction, where you're coming back and you're really thinking about this? So we showed them cartoons of characters doing good and bad things, or pro-social and antisocial actions, and we looked at what their brains did. And it turns out that within the snap of a fingers, within 200 milliseconds, they also showed this immediate distinction between good and bad scenes, between watching pro-social characters and watching antisocial characters. But again, it wasn't the whole story. It turns out that they also show these later cognitively controlled reappraisals. They're coming back and thinking about the scene more, particularly coming back and thinking about the pro-social actions over the antisocial actions more. And what was particularly surprising is that it was precisely the individual differences, the kids that looked and went back more at the pro-social scenes over the antisocial, that translated this into their own sharing behaviors. So we measured how much they would share with others of stickers, and as it looks like, these later aspects, if they went back more to the pro-social versus antisocial, they shared more with others. We said, great, this is fascinating. We have this dual system aspect of morality. But when does it start? So some had argued that since about 6 months of age, you start to see rudimentary moral judgments. You start to see a differentiation between good and bad actions. So we said, okay, let's try to get down to 6 months, but in reality, to put an EEG cap on a 6-month-old is a nightmare. They move too much. So we got down to 12 months of age. And we did a similar study where we were showing actions that were good and bad. And infants also showed, or toddlers in this case, also showed that automatic gut reaction and that longer-term cognitive controlled reaction. And the most fascinating piece of that study is where those later cognitively controlled actions that come back more on the pro-social than antisocial side directly related to parents' values about justice and harm to others. This is some of the work I presented when I first applied to the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay to start to work here. And my friend, my colleague, and my collaborator, Dr. Sawa Senzaki, challenged me after showing these slides, and she said, that's great, this is fascinating, but why? Why are parents' aspects reflected in their kids? How does this socialization occur? And doesn't culture matter? And thus begins the next chapter of this research. Here's Sawa.
So we tend to think that brain tells us how we should feel, what actions that we take, and behaviors that we engage in. But in recent research, the field, such as cultural neuroscience, has shown us some evidence that brain is not doing all the work by itself. So I want to talk about cultural neuroscience, but before I want to talk about the word culture. Culture is a big word. In fact, there are more than 140 definitions of the word culture, and that's good, that makes sense, because culture is important. Culture enables us to learn from others, learn from the previous generations, and allow us to put our cognitive resources together and work together. But in the field of psychology, it's been fairly recent years that psychologists start to understand the influence of culture on our psychological processes. So cultural psychologists study the ways that we think, habits, activities, and practices. So things like fighting, sleeping, eating, joking, parenting, and those small elements of culture and how they work together to create this somewhat coherent and sensible understanding of our social world. And knowing that culture is realized and recreated in those mundane everyday activities. But the central idea is that there's this meaning system and patterns that are organized by an underlying logic of a culture. But when we ask people, what are those underlying cultural logics? Most people are not really able to fully articulate what they are. And that's because culture for humans is kind of like water for fish. We can't see it. We take it for granted. Even scientists have been taking it for granted. So one way to show how culture impacts our psychological processes is by comparing two or more cultural groups. So when it comes to morality, we think that culture provides the semiotic grid for the meaning system, how we define and construct this idea of morality. For example, previous research had studied cross-cultural differences in morality and how children understand moral transgressions. So researchers ask children what they think about some stories. For example, let's say we have this Annie. She hits Isabel because Isabel knocked over this tower Annie just made. Or Johnny is making fun of Michael. And what do you think about it? Kids in the US typically say, that's wrong or that's bad, but they don't really explain why, whereas the same age group of children in Hong Kong are more likely to say something like, well, that will hurt her, or he'll be sad. So they seem to have more focus on the welfares of other people. But where do those cultural differences come from? So in our labs, we've been inviting parents and children come and participate in our studies together. And we show those kinds of moral scenarios, and we ask parents to talk about those situations to their children. And the findings have been pretty consistent, that parents in the US are more likely to focus on the agents in the scene. So in this example, the character who is engaging in bad or good actions, and say something like, such a nice bear, or the piggy is being so mean. Whereas the parents in Japan are more likely to talk about emotions of the victims or the recipient. So say something like, oh, such a poor elephant, he must be sad. And we're not trying to say one is better than the other. Again, this is one way to show how culture impacts our psychological processes. So going back to the original idea of cultural neuroscience, the idea is going beyond that nature versus nurture debate, but rather we should think about how nature is nurtured through culture to make one fully human. So the cumulative effects of cultural practices and socialization take place over time, and those experiences over time will leave marks on the patterns of neurons that are firing together. So those parents talking to their children in the lab are not only telling children what the goods and bads are, but in their everyday practices, the way that the parents are interacting with their children are shaping the brains of children and the neural pathways that leads to social, moral, and cognitive development. So when Jason talked about when we see those kinds of moral situations, we tend to have those kinds of early gut reaction type of response in our neural responses. And then later on, there's more controlled cognitive aspects of morality, such as sympathy, empathy, perspective takings, or judgments. We think that that's where parenting and cultural practices would come in. So in our neuroscience and child's lab at UW Green Bay, we've been working on this project funded by the National Institute of Health with our talented and hardworking undergraduate students, researchers on this project. And we've been impacted by the COVID-19, just like many other researchers in the world. But this semester, we're back in the lab, and we're really excited to continue on this project. Thank you.
Jason, Sawa, thank you so much for being here. You are the first duo to appear on the show, so I feel a little overwhelmed. Like,
There's two of us up here and whatever.
how is this going to work? There's so much more knowledge on the stage right now. I have so many questions and things that I could go through that we'll get to along the way, but just the nature and nurture element of things that you were talking about, just the universality of things that move across cultures. But I'll try to start with, something that you kind of covered, but before coming here, like I've read some of your work, and it seems that you both have a similar method and similar tools, like using visual cues that are narratives that children will look at and interpret, but you have like a different purpose. And I'm Jason, if I'm right, like you're thinking about empathy and a sort of a moral formation in the brain. And gosh, I could talk about that for a long time. Not talk about it, ask questions about it. It's probably more appropriate. And Sawa, that you're more thinking of the connections across cultures and how that happens. And so what brought you together in a way that these things make sense to you as collaborators? That's the longest question I've ever asked on this, so go ahead.
I'll jump in and start. So I think a key piece is that both of us, to some extent, are trained as developmental psychologists. And so, Sawa's far more on the cultural side, and I'm far more on the neuro side, but we share a common element of wondering how children and adults get to the point that they're at. So it's not just where they are, but it's how do they get there? What's the process of change that happens? And both of us come from a social cognition, broadly speaking, background, which means that the domains that we're asking, the morality, empathy, self-control, perspective-taking, attention, all overlap to some extent. And a lot of it actually has to do with some of the historic theories of moral development, which all have to do with, does morality stem from better cognitive understanding? Does morality stem from better empathy? Does it stem from increased attention? Does it stem from socialization? And so a piece of that is when you come and you have a situation where two people have come at comparable ideas from different sides, you go, well, let's do something. And there's an exciting moment where you say, what's the next question? How can we put these together? And I'd say in this case, it was particularly bringing forward morality. It seemed like the ideal venue to say, right, but what are parents doing? And it was partially off of the last slide I talked about with infants, where some of the neural work I had been doing had shown that parent values already seemed to be reflected in the way that their 12-month-olds were processing morality. Mm-hmm. And that really, Sawa had a million questions, and then it just made us think, how cool. This is the best way to take steps in research.
Yeah. So and you talked a little bit about starting with children, and so why this group? Why not like teenagers, or just thinking about the development that is there? As an outsider who doesn't really know the field, I would think okay, then the formative years this is the time when this is really important. And I think culturally we hear a lot about, it's harder to learn things when you're older, and that's discouraging. So why children? And
So from my perspective as a cultural psychologist, we think that it takes a couple of years at least for children to understand those culturally shared values and ideas. So we wanted to see at the point where children start to understand what parents are trying to teach them, but not quite fully having very specific ways of seeing the world from their cultural kind of lens. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to get to the children who are young enough, but starting to understand, being able to have conversations with their parents. And that was kind of the right age group, is preschool, not quite in the school age yet. And we wanted to see really the interactions between the parents and children.
Mm-hmm. So what if, and I was, saw when I was reading some of the work that you had done, where you described the scenes where the child is looking at something, mm-hmm. and you're also measuring sort of the parental input, like in duration and how much they have to say it. But I'm also then thinking about children outside of that environment. Like, who do they really spend more time with? So I can imagine putting two children of the same age next to each other, and the person gets pushed down the hill in the narrative, and hilarity ensues, right? Like, that's pretty much Warner Brothers, like in a nutshell, right?
Yes.
So is that, I guess the assumption that I would make is, okay, the parental influence is so much more, but I think about the amount of time that some children spend away from their parents, and how does that play into this at all? And that's for either of you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And when we see the developmental patterns of how culture shapes our psychological processes, we actually see a little bit of dip in sort of adolescence time. So we kind of think they're drifting. And even when we see the historical patterns of how culture has been shaping like arts, and historically we see some of the the mainstream art and then deviating in some areas and kind of coming back to the traditional art. And we see that similar patterns, interestingly, with human development. So when we see, when you think about development as a lifespan development, not just young children, we do see that early, like very early on in infancy, we think that the children are probably fairly similar across cultures, and then we start to see some differences in early childhood age, and then continuing to show more of the differences. But then when they reach to adolescence time, they really deviate from the traditional cultural practice standpoint and start doing something new, which makes sense. That's what we see. And then they kind of start conforming back to the social norm when they become parents themselves. And so we see kind of ebbs and flows in that.
So is that what you mean by you didn't use the word biological, but the biological part of it having more time to be filtered through the culture, the more time that you spend in a culture, you deviate more from that baseline.
I think so. And I think it's the morality, like the development of morality is also interesting, that how children in young age are very rule followers, right? They like to follow the rules. They want to tell other people what the rules are, and then they start to deviate from those behaviors too.
It's even they'll constantly talk about an authority figure as being the reason you can't do something is because dad said you can't do it, or mom said you can't do it. So it's a very different kind of moral judgment than you would get by, hopefully, later childhood, 8, 9, 10 years of age.
Yeah. Now that's some parenting I can get on board with. No, I'm just totally kidding. So we do have some questions coming in. Your colleague, Ryan Martin, is spamming the question box here. And Dr. Martin asks, if parents value empathy and want to cultivate this in their children, what can they do? And that links to a question I have on here about empathy. And to me, this is actually a controversial sort of topic, but can empathy be taught? And that's what I hear.
Yeah, this is kind of the $1 million question, because it seems like in politics and everything, we keep talking about how we need to have more empathy for the other. And even in some of the studies that I just referenced, it's about taking the other's perspective more effectively to get there. And there may be elements where that is exactly what should happen to get towards morality. And there may be ways to teach that I'll get to in a second. The controversial part of empathy on the other side, though, is too much empathy oftentimes yields tribalism. That's one of the key pieces where if you can truly take the perspective of the other individual, you feel closer to them, you prefer them more. As you start to prefer them more, their mind frame becomes your mind frame. And so it's one of the arguments for potentially why we have so much polarization happening, so much tribalistic aspects happening, is just too much empathy in some ways for just our in-group. And so it yields a lot of in-group, out-group aspects. Can we train empathy? It comes a lot down to training emotional processing and emotional understanding in kids. There are a couple of different programs that have been aiming to do this. One comes out and it's all about reading works of fiction that detail the emotional states of others.
That is always the best process for doing anything.
I figured you would resonate in multiple ways. Yeah, it's a series of studies that came out of I believe it's the New School in the early 2010s, where they were reading children text that had to do with emotions versus just fictional texts. And they started to find that the kids that had this emotional content material being read to them were better at taking the perspectives of others, seemed to show more empathy, and potentially it extends toward they were more pro-social to others as well, which is the ultimate
In the
goal.
works of fiction, you mean?
Yeah, so reading about the emotional states of others in works of fiction versus just reading works of fiction that don't talk about the emotions of others while they're going through it.
Yeah, it seems like more work. Like you have to go through the process of imagining what that is like.
And that's to kind of touch back towards what you originally asked of why this age group. A key piece of this age group of preschoolers that we're studying has to do with some of the general processes that they are able to start to do at those ages. So somewhere between 3 and 8 years of age, you get better self-control abilities. They can start to take the directions they know to be what they should do and apply it into their actual actions. They can start to take the perspectives of others. They can start to understand that the emotions of others are not their own emotions. If you ask a 3-year-old what mama's feeling, it's going to be, well, I feel sad, so they must feel sad, or I feel happy, so they must feel happy, and it mirrors what they feel. It's right around 4, 5 years of age that you start to get this understanding that emotions might be different, and so you can start to intervene on that. There are some programs that are trying to intervene as well in empathy that are aiming towards more holistic education, where it's you start to be more mindful of others, you start to understand others through mindfulness and meditation really is kind of the other big realm that they're trying with.
Yeah, my kids would look at me and say, "Dad's experiencing ennui again," when they were children. You know, Sawa, this reminds me of something I read in some of your work. Like you, I think both of you talk about the pro-social and the anti-social, and I guess we're just saying good behaviors and bad behaviors. Which to me like sort of gestures toward a universal or a consistent agreement on what those behaviors are. And can you say more about that, like how you arrive at what you determine to be pro-social versus anti-social?
Yeah, so I think that across cultures, parents do want to teach children to be good, whatever the good means in that cultural groups.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the universality is, that most parents, I think virtually across the cultures, would agree that they want to teach children to be good children. But then culture comes in to tells us what it means to be good, what kind of behaviors are good, and we are seeing differences in the ways that how we understand and define this idea of good and bad.
Like, you know, the reason I ask is I was thinking about, like, trying to think of examples, because the narratives that you show the children, they're very physical. You know, like somebody's going up a hill,
Yep.
and somebody gets pushed back down the hill, or they get knocked down, or I don't know if somebody's hit with a ball or it's taken away.
Right.
So again, there's a very Warner Brothers theme here. But I think about like American culture, and as I was reading your work, I was thinking about things like coaching, where the whole notion of tough love, where you have an adult essentially screaming at sometimes other adults, but also teens and younger children, and that this is seen as a good thing. Like, I guess I'm not asking you if that's a good thing or not, but like, is that behavior that we actually accept as pro-social in this culture?
Well, so I think not just cultural differences, but within the culture, again, culture is kind of recreated too, right? So different errors that might be good at different times, and it might not be good in other times. So I don't think it's really this solid, this is the good behavior and bad behavior, and it's not black and white.
I'm in the camp that it was never good, but there are people who would who firmly disagree with me, that say, you just can't take it, right? And then so enough of my questions. We have some other ones coming in here. Sorry, there are a lot. I have to get back to where we were. Here's one. Do you think, and this is for either of you, do you think we ever stop emotionally developing? Is there any age or stage of development when morality can no longer be altered? And I'll just sort of pair this with the cynical question that I had written down was, wow, all these kids seem really good when they're young, and what the hell happens to everybody when they get older? But I know there are a lot of good people in the world. So to the question, do we ever stop emotionally developing?
I mean, I'll hop in and say no. I think if you take the perspective that I think both of us take, that the moral brain, or what we want to talk about as an adult moral brain, is a lot of general processes working together. All of those are changing. So something like self-control isn't going to reach adult level efficiency until about age 26. So you get maximal density over some of the areas that are responsible by age 8, but it's between 8 and 26 that you start to get efficiency. And all of the pruning that happens, all the myelination that happens, is partially based on the experiences that people are having. So the experiences are constantly yielding changes to neurochemistry. And as they're changing the structure of your brain, it's going to change how fast you respond to things, what is particularly salient, the kinds of memories that are evoked the moment that you're trying to make a decision, because that's also a key piece of it. So if you think that it's kind of constructed from all of these general systems, and those themselves are changing, so self-control 26, then you start to have a little bit of a down, and then you start to have all the way to about age 80, you have constant restructuring of aspects of that system.
So there's a question connected to this. At least I think it is, based on what you just said. Is there a critical point for development of empathy then, and morality? Because you just seem to be talking about a timeline. And there is a lot of, I feel like a sort of a hot pop psychology question is, can people change? How do you change people's minds? And this is something that comes up a lot. So is there a critical point?
So I'm going to talk about something that's not morality. Sorry for a second, but
Wow. Oh my goodness. Go ahead.
there are things that are kind of a critical point, right? Like language development, for example, happens really early. It has to be like around age 1, and if that's passed, it's really difficult to differentiate some of the sound units in language, for example. And as an example, in terms of what I'm familiar with culture, and when people move to different cultures, studies have shown that if you move to another culture before age 15, how long you live in the new culture tends to correlate with how much you're going to be acculturated in that place. And then between age 15 to 30, the age that you move to the new culture, if you're between the ages of 15 and 30, it doesn't really matter how long you live, you're going to be about the same. And then after the age of 30 is the time that you move to the new culture. The longer you live in the new culture, you're going to actually be less likely to be acculturated in that place. So it's negative correlation. So there are aspects of things that are more likely to be changing in certain times and later times. But in terms of morality, go ahead, Jason.
No, you're right here in exactly the analogous processes you talked about, because I think if you're talking about morality, or empathy for that matter, well, you do need some early experience with it. Otherwise, there will be some issues. You can develop, I would argue, rudimentary versions of it, even if you were completely deprived of interpersonal contact for the first, I don't know, decade. You'd still be able to develop aspects of it, but there's going to be problems. Most of this, if it's based off of the experiences we're having, understanding others in pain, reading about others in pain, understanding good and bad actions, having our parents, as we study in the lab, having our parents talk to us about this. If parents aren't talking about it, it's going to have an impact where development is delayed. It doesn't mean it can't happen. So in a critical or sensitive periods kind of question, it doesn't mean it can't happen. It's going to mean it's a lot harder to happen, is what I'd say.
And I'm going to want to connect on narrative, like, because to me that feels like a continual theme here, talking about something that's just really framed through stories, whether they're visual or not. But I do want to honor the questions that are coming in. And for either of you, this is an interesting question. Have you studied or noticed any differences within siblings or family members in the research that you've done?
So I think that's a really interesting question. As a parent, when I see two of my children, they look vastly different from my viewpoint. But then when I actually look and study their behaviors, actions, they are pretty similar. So I think that the parents tend to notice the differences between the siblings, but the families come from the similar backgrounds, tend to be kind of similar, not necessarily exactly the same, but they tend to be similar patterns of the ideas and understanding in general.
Yeah, I just, a question like that makes me think of tropes that we're used to, like the black sheep of the family or whatever, and
Yeah.
how accepted that is in a way that maybe it shouldn't be. So as a follow-up to that, there's another really good question here. Do you think children who experience trauma have a harder time with the development of empathy and morality? But Sawa, I think it would apply to anything cultural, to be honest. Like,
Well, yeah, there are some really interesting studies have been done. For example, that children grow up in more kind of like a refugee children, and then when they were adopted in the new society and the age of the adoption happening have effect on their development. So yes, I think the trauma can have challenges, have impacts, but also then there are interesting studies showing resilience, right? So some studies are showing now that the resilience matters, and people who are having negative experiences in childhood or young age may actually can be helpful to some extent. And it's interesting to understand what is it that those challenges in young age, how that what's the tipping like that affects negatively to some extent and that affects positively to some people. So what is that? And I think that would be a really interesting question to ask.
so what you're saying is that a coach yelling at you when you're
Yeah, so
younger
that might be actually a good thing. Yes,
it's obviously
yes.
what we all need. So I have this question is specific to you, 'cause this based on what you just said. I was thinking about when I was reading your work, and if I was interpreting this right, so I came up through literary studies and lit theory and all of that, where there was this time in the 50s, I was not there, obviously, but that there was, that structuralism was the thing, that it was going to show connections across cultures. And then we moved into the post-structural era where those things were not present, and we really wanted to undermine the sense that cultures would be consistent for any reason that were biological, essentially. But it seemed to me that the conclusions that you came to were that, at least in those early stages, that there was just a similarity between the children, whether they were Japanese or American, or I think they were American, right? And so, but then also I was thinking of the other part in your research where you said, and correct me if I get this wrong, but that the Japanese mothers thought differently about the way they talked about the world, that they just tended to make more connections to things in the background, I think was the way you put it. Whereas in like the American, I think they were mothers, were really focused on nouns and foregrounded things. And I think there's a line in one of your paragraphs that says that Chinese mothers tended to use more verbs or something like. I notice things about verbs, so I see that and I get excited. Can you say something about that, just about the nature of what the connections are across cultures? But then when I read about that kind of difference, that seems really significant. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the language development is very interesting, and I think language and culture are very closely knit. When we think about culture, we somehow have to kind of talk about one culture over another culture, but then they're always overlapping. But how do we differentiate different groups of cultures? And language is one way to kind of tell us, okay, this is maybe culture A and culture B. So there are studies have shown that some English has a lot of focus on nouns. So the parents, when parents talk to their children and infants, are a lot more likely to label objects. And then children have really strong object bias. So when they see objects in the scene, they're much more likely to pay attention to something that's more focal or salient in that image. So the focal objects or foreground objects. Whereas other languages, like a lot of Asian languages, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, are not so much about those nouns, but sometimes they use more verbs, and that can relate to the ways that how children pay attention to their visual world. And it's not just extreme one way or the other. There's always kind of an extent to which this one is greater in one culture over another culture. But we are seeing some of those differences, so the noun or object bias may not be as strong in other children who are grown up in linguistic communities that are not really so focused on nouns.
Yep. When I was reading that, I couldn't help thinking of this, but it was controversial at the time and stereotypical in its designation, but
Right.
the whole phenomenon of the tiger mom
Yep.
and that
Yep.
or the helicopter parent,
Yep.
because you kind of have helicopter well, they're just invited in and they comment, right,
Right.
with the children. But based on what I was reading in your work, it seemed to me that the identification of the mother was really that she was acting in a way that culturally was not what we were used to in some way. But, when you were looking at parents interacting with their children, did you ever get a sense that because I think you measured the actual time that parents spoke or how
Yes.
many times they spoke.
Yep.
Did you get a sense that there could be too much, that there would be an interference there where you couldn't process if you were a child?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. We didn't really study exactly like if that's going to be interfering the children's understanding, but so the way that how parents, in another study that we just did, the way that the parents, there were cultural differences in the US that parents were more kind of children-centered language users. So they would say something like, what did you think? Or asking children about questions, whereas a lot of Japanese mothers were more likely to talk about their own perspectives and kind of like, see, this is what I think, don't you agree with me sort of approach. And that actually didn't have any relationship to the way that the children were paying attention to the visual fields, but it was the content that shared meaning system that I would say the collective kind of meanings were the ones that were more relating to the ways that the children are viewing their visual environment. But there are some differences in the ways that how parents communicate to their children too.
I have another question here, and I'm going to read this one because it's going to force me to pronounce a part of the brain, and I'm up for this challenge right now. Let me clear my throat. Would there be problems with morality development if there was damage to the amygdala? Did I say that right?
Yeah, you did.
Oh boy.
I'll jump in on that one. Yes is the answer. So amygdala are going to be a key piece within the broader limbic system or emotion processing system. Particularly, they're relevant to processing fear or situations like that, but they're activated in a host of different scenarios as you're trying to evaluate the emotional the aspects of the emotion of those that you're seeing or situations you're watching. And in morality, a key piece is understanding the emotions of the people that are acting. So this comes back to when you were saying a coach yelling at a player versus someone screaming at another person in everyday life. The context and the way that the people are interacting is going to partially influence your own perspectives of it and your own judgments of morality. So damage to the amygdala would definitely have impacts on the extent to which you would say this is good versus bad. You could probably get at whether it is a right or wrong action, but you wouldn't feel as strongly about whether it's a right or wrong action with damage to amygdala.
So it makes me want to move into this question. So I want to ask about genetics a little bit, because in reading your work, like socially, I feel like you're in a position that is, although you're pursuing knowledge, you're doing experiments, you're still like moving into this kind of controversial area. And what brought this to mind for me was there was a story in the New Yorker recently about Catherine Page Harden, who is a neurogeneticist. And what I took away from this article was that she was really showing that genetics did have something to do with people's ability to learn, but it was within like groups. And when you make a claim like that in a world where the bell curve exists, and when people talk about genetics, it doesn't take long for people to start talking about eugenics and making judgments about people based on race, on gender, and all that. So I'm not saying anything you don't know. But I'm also thinking about how it's like saying that, you know, the material that this chair is made out of doesn't matter, but it does, because if it were made on something else, it might not work. So what has your work told you about genetics and how I don't even know how to phrase this, how it shapes who we are, like in a way that makes sense to you, but is not just sort of this on-off sort of cultural approach to it, where if something's genetic, it's bad because that means we're going to separate people into different categories of superior and inferior.
You mind if I start? Yeah.
And that's a lot. I'm sorry.
No, it's one of the big questions on child development has to do with the extent to which genetics in its purest form of just the genes and their phenotypic outcomes will play out in kids. It matters a ton when we're talking about the parent situations because of shared genetics in this case. One of the papers that I would say, so the work of Sandra Scar from the 1980s is kind of one of the best ways I would say to think about gene by environment interactions, which is increasingly the way that I think we would think about the role that genetics play, which is not a predestination or a predetermined route. It sets up a propensity that given certain types of environmental situations are going to interact to some kind of outcome. And so in Sandra Scar's work, she kept trying to emphasize that gene by environment interactions can happen in multiple ways. They can happen in the active way, which is a parent's genetics mirror a kid's genetics, and thus the parent is actively teaching a child certain things because that's what matters to them, and that's what certain candidate genes would yield as personality, certain candidate genes would yield as intelligence type aspects, and thus that's a sharing of cultural phenomenon, of moral ideas. It can also happen in other ways. It can happen in a passive, which is you're setting up environments for your child that reflect the kinds of things that are what you prefer, and it just so happens that that likely is what your child will prefer as well because of shared genetics in that way. And the last one is evocative, which is one that we think about much less, but an evocative gene by environment interaction is where, because of the shared genetics, you're going to have particularly physical traits that mirror your parent. You're going to have, in many cases, comparable personality aspects, comparable facial features, et cetera. Like, obviously variation within that, but something, which means the world will approach you in the same way. And so you will have the same types of experiences that your parent had, and thus the experiences that are shaping brain formation will be partially genetic, but it's because you're having the same experiences.
It just leads me down to sub-questions about, well, you could have adopted children and... go ahead, Sawa.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of follow up on what Jason's saying. So we do know that there are specific type of genotypes are more common in one culture or one racial ethnic groups over other ethnic groups. We just did actually a study with Rybak in human biology and looked at some cultural differences in genotypes, but also that kind of following up on what Jason is talking about is gene culture or gene environment interaction, and putting culture in it. So there are some, so for example, oxytocin, we know that oxytocin is kind of like an emotion happy kind of genes, right? We tend to think more oxytocin is good, but there are different alleles of oxytocins. But we know that how that's expressed in our behaviors are different, adapting. And so in one culture, suppressing emotion is actually good. In some Asian cultures, for example. So having one type G allele of oxytocin in Korea, people tend to suppress their emotions. They don't show emotions as much because that's more culturally appropriate behaviors. But then in the US, people who have similar type of G allele of oxytocin are more likely to show their emotions because that's more appropriate in that culture. So yes, genetically there are differences across race and ethnic groups, but also how those genes are expressed can be more adaptations in that cultural group.
So something I think about with psychologists is pop psychology must be the bane of your existence in a lot of ways. That like I mean, and genetics plays into that. It's like, oh, that someone is a good egg, right? Or I guess, going back to the question of staying with the question of genetics and how that's perceived, like culturally in the US, I guess, do you think that we're ready to try to do the things that you just described, to acknowledge genetics as a thing? And did you say it was gene by environment?
Yeah, gene by environment interaction or gene by environment correlation are the two kind of terms.
Like, are we ready to actually put those things to use? I mean, because you do research, you come up with findings, things that can help people. Are we ready to accept the terms of that kind of research and try to and actually improve our lives?
I mean, I'd argue, I would hope we're ready in some ways.
Like your
but I
optimism.
think it's also an element of understanding that no single gene is going to be responsible for the types of things we're talking about in psychology. It's going to be hundreds and hundreds of combinations of short and long alleles across a host of candidate genes. So you take something like autism spectrum disorder that's thought to have such a genetic basis to it to some extent, and yet you're talking about, I mean, as of recent meta-reviews, it's over 300, I believe, candidate genes and combinations that could yield this. So you're not talking about a one-to-one relation. And I think once that starts to be the understanding, it's that, hey, some combination of an oxytocin reception is going to yield better or worse in certain environments, social understanding. When you get to that kind of nuance, it gets lost in most cases, but also hopefully it ends up meaning it's not a damning thing that's happening. It's not going to be prescriptive of failure in something that you can't do. It's just saying some of the variance is responsible for making it easier or harder to do something.
Yeah, but it does cut against that pop psychology of really like the investment in the will, and that is all that matters. And something that you said, so I know both of you like to hook people up to machines, right? And you look at pictures of their brain activity. Is that accurate? Oh, good. So I just read this novel by Richard Powers called Bewilderment, and I wanted to read a passage from this to get your thoughts on this. And I did send it to you, but just for a little background, is the main characters are a father and a son, and the father never labels the son with anything like being on the spectrum or autism or anything. But the father is also, as a character, really resistant to medicating, and he's trying to find a different way. And Richard Powers is a novelist, is somebody who works science and do his work a lot. And so here's a passage that reminded me a lot of the work that you do. And so he's thinking about bringing his son in to be connected to a machine to look at brainwaves. But it says, the passage is, the Courier Lab was exploring something called decoded neurofeedback. It resembled old-fashioned biofeedback, but with neural imaging for real-time AI-mediated feedback. A first group of subjects, the targets, entered emotional states in response to external prompts, while researchers scanned relevant regions of their brains using fMRI. The researchers then scanned the same brain regions of a second group of subjects, the trainees, in real time. AI monitored the neural activity and sent auditory and visual cues to steer the trainees toward the target's pre-recorded neural states. In this way, the trainees learned to approximate the patterns of excitation in the target's brains and remarkably began to report having similar emotions. So at least what I read there being described is that the type of work that you do in some ways in this book is being presented as like a way to help people develop emotions. And how do you feel about what you heard there? Is it pure fiction, or is there something to what's being said?
I mean, I'll start with the response. I don't think it's pure fiction. I don't know that it goes quite to the extent that it's said. And so I think there's a lot of emphasis on trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes, for that matter. And this is a biofeedback route of doing that. The goal here is, if you can create the same pattern of brain activation, do you create the same emotion? And you don't create the exact same emotion, but you create an approximation of the same type of thing. The biofeedback seems to be a type of method that has been handy. And when you add the neuroside in, so whether that's EEG like we do in the labs, or it's fMRI, where you're getting much more spatial localization of where in the brain is activating instead of when, you can help to push someone along a path a little faster. This started, I would say, in some work with children with ADHD or attention deficit disorders, and they were trying to look at how can we do this without medication. And so they tried to do neurofeedback routes towards this, and there's been some success in, if you can show what's happening in the brain and start to change people towards the route it should be, they will be able to do these skills. It seems to have an effect. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say if you can completely put yourself in the person's shoes, you're going to care as much about the same things and then apply that to action. So emotion and emotion understanding of others is one element of it, but you have to add the other elements of it, of morality, I would say, to truly care about this.
And you had mentioned medication. So in this novel, the father, for whatever reasons, doesn't want to medicate his son, and so then I think about the world we live in, and there is at least the perception that some people have that medication is the primary treatment for everything, and it sets up this kind of research and approach as an alternative to it. So it's pitting one against the other. But I don't know if that's really, is that how you would ever view some of the work that you do as a different approach to something, as an alternative to it, or is that something that doesn't come into your thinking at all? And you don't have to mention any specific pharmaceutical companies because we alienate all our sponsors.
So I usually work with non-clinical children, so children that are not typically diagnosed with different types of disorders. So I don't necessarily think that type of work that I do or we do in the labs, thinking about as kind of a methods to help people to go one way or the other, but rather kind of trying to have a basic understanding of psychological functions and what are the brain activities, what are the parenting, what are the kind of a typical things happening, and how that happens over time or in the lab, or changes or not changes, and hope that those works can be used in a more applied field of research and taking to the area where that maybe we can help children. Yep. But that's not typically what I do in my lab.
And that's not to say that people don't do this. So there are groups that, so Sawa was talking about differences in oxytocin, for instance. And there are some groups that have made the argument that nose squirts of oxytocin, nasal administration of oxytocin, can yield better social bonding, might be a potential aspect for people who have social cognitive deficits. There's even a pilot study in the last 5 or 6 years, I believe it was in Australia, that was trying to administer this to children on the spectrum to see if they could. And while it's had some effects, it's not necessarily as clear as a lot of these behavioral or biofeedback sort of methods. We don't do those in the lab, but I would say there is some promise in some ways towards experiences and practice at this, towards, especially in kids, changing the nature of a neural network rather than a medicative approach.
I was really hoping for you were going to say yes. You could set me up that, so for example, you have a colleague who writes about anger, and we could look at what anger in the brain looks like. And so, hypothetically, you could have somebody who was like patient 0 for anger, and then teach them how to not be angry by showing them things. You're saying,
we've got to look towards Dr. Ryan Martin for that, but yeah.
You're saying this is not something we can do this evening. I wanted to get back to a question that had come in, and so this is, I think, for both of you. If a culture has higher morality and empathy, how can you pinpoint what within that culture cultivates higher rates of that empathy and morality?
So I wouldn't necessarily say that one culture has higher portion of morality over another culture, but again, we think that things like parenting would probably help, or different ways of schools, education. There are many different routes that we can teach different types of morality. I also wanted to kind of, going back to earlier on,
Please
the
do,
comment,
yeah.
sorry, going back to a quick comment about, like how children, it sounds like they're such great children in early ages, and then we all become these crazy people. I think that's kind of part of the development to take risk behaviors, and that's a typical normal development. But also, I think that in our societies, we tend to focus on negative, bad things, right? So in our everyday lives, there are lots of good things happening, but we don't really talk about it. We don't really pay attention. Just for a quick example, I ordered a sandwich today at the cafeteria, but I was late to go pick it up, so I was like 40 minutes late, and my sandwich was just sitting there on the counter in a hallway. Everybody's walking around, and nobody took my sandwich, right? It's there. So we have this kind of a generalized trust to each other in our society, and that's how we function, but we don't really think about it. So when Jason and I try to think about stimuli or pictures to show our participants to think about good and bad scenarios, and it's really easy to come up with bad scenarios, like hitting each other or something. But when we try to come up with good situations, it's really difficult, because typically it's just something that's not bad is kind of good. So I think we just kind of in our society tend to focus on bad things, but there are lots of good things happening, and we just maybe not paying close attention.
I mean,
to
even
those.
you just going back to the point about narrative, even you just telling that story, I could picture your lonely sandwich sitting on the top of this thing, and like it conveyed the power of it to me. And I'll just keep going back to Warner Brothers cartoons, because they seem to fit your scenarios in the lab where they make a living out of antisocial behavior, right? I mean, this is this is what this is. We collect this, and I watch those over and over with my kids, and now that I've read your research, I feel terrible. So,
But I think the thing is, it's exactly those stimuli that we see, and as adults, we definitely laugh at, and usually kids are laughing to some extent, and it is in the conversations then that as a parent you're having with your kids to describe what you just saw, to walk through that, to say why it's good or bad, and see the cultural differences in that discussion that kind of guide the future development they'll have.
we'll have a separate episode on Roadrunner. Would be really good. There was a question that came in a while ago. I don't know. I wanted to throw this out because it's interesting. Is there evidence of morality? And I think this would apply to other things as well in non-humans, in other mammals, primates.
So I was going to go for the long answer on this, so I'll send it her way in a
here
second.
for it, yeah.
Because yes is the answer. There's so many cool things that chimpanzees, for instance, have done that have to do with pro-social behaviors and sharing actions. There's some evidence from the early 2010s that rats may, especially to their friends or cage mates, sacrifice part of their own resources in order to free a cage mate. And so it's kind of a very rudimentary morality, but there's an argument that they're trying to help each other.
This is a Pixar prison film waiting to happen.
It is, right?
Okay.
And so there's some cool evidence that animals have some, but Sawa can definitely mention this more.
All right, Sawa, let's have it.
Well, so again, how do we define morality, and based on whose culture that we are defining morality? But there is some evidence that dolphins are carrying a dead calf on the back for a couple of days. Even that leaves trace of bloods, and that's kind of dangerous for their livings. Or the magpies, or the birds are really amazing, right? They're like magpies, look like they're doing a little dance of funeral when there's a dead magpie, and they would call others, and there's some social interactions. There's a group of magpies. I've seen that when I was living in Canada in my backyard, that they were doing a little dance. Elephants, when one of the elephants dies, sometimes they put like the twigs and other like leaves over, and seems again kind of like almost like mourning. So that looks like morality. And the meerkat is my favorite.
The meerkats had to come up. We're good.
Had to come in here. So meerkats
I hope
are.
my mom's watching right now. She watches actual TV programming on meerkats.
Meerkat's manure is my favorite, but okay. Anyway, sorry. But the meerkats, they seem to kind of teach the young pups to engage in, well, it involves killing by eating scorpions, because scorpions have poisons and they have to kill it in a certain way before they can eat it. And they engage in some teaching, and that kind of almost seems like morality in a way. But it's hard, like, are we putting ourselves in too much and reading into those behaviors and calling that morality or emotions or whatnot? So.
Well, I mean, I'm interested in thinking about, this is going to veer off a little bit, but climate crisis and thinking about ways we engage with the world, that, biomimicry is a technique that's worth thinking about, where we would imitate the behaviors that you're describing now. You're making me feel like most other animals are better than we are. I'll do some meerkat research. This is a serious question coming, I swear. I was thinking about, when I read both of your work, like the animals that you chose, because a lot of them the actors are non-human, and I was wondering like why that was, if it was to not have certain gender, to not have certain race, but then it's like, it's the piggy who's bad, right? And it's the bear who's good. Are you working with certain, I feel like you're unfairly judging animals, is really what I'm getting, this is what I'm getting at, but I want to hear more about the animal selection process.
I'll say a lot of our current pieces that we've been going are just shapes, different colored shapes, with the hope that it doesn't have as much of a potential background, that we're not unfairly judging that piggy. Right. But that is a key element of it, which is, even when we've tried to move beyond shapes, because we've been brainstorming a lot to go, what are other things that aren't humans that would show race or gender differences that would naturally influence the types of judgments we would make? And it keeps coming back to, our only safe things are animated characters that don't have any kind of race or gender, or animals, but animals can be culturally specific as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and we try to counterbalance. So in one situations where the piggy is a good one, or another, so we do try to make sure that they can be good and bad in different situations.
I love that you considered the piggy's image as you,
Yes,
as you
it's
were
very important,
setting up your study. You should put that in the methods section. That's, and there was a question I was going to ask, and it just flew out of my head. But now I know what it was. It flew back in, because you used a bird analogy earlier, and I remember that. So the visual plays a big role in the work that you do. You're providing visual cues, and they're responding to these things, and sometimes with objects even. But as I was reading that, I was thinking a lot about like how much I know that I did, and some others, like parents, read to their children. I was wondering if there were auditory differences, that would a child react the same way to antisocial behavior? I can tell you that my kids did when I read them Harry Potter, for instance. They knew clearly who was good, who was bad. So have you delved into that at all, a non-visual? I mean, Sawa, I think the closest that with the parent talking, that's an auditory response. But
Right, yeah, so the narratives are usually communication, and that's talking, and that's more auditory, but it is difficult to do research in that, because visuals are easier. We can measure where people are looking at exactly. We can look at pupil diameters. There are lots of techniques that we can use. With auditory, is a little bit challenging. There are some work cross-culturally. For example, some cultures are more sensitive to different tones of the voice. Like when you say happy in a really happy voice versus happy in a really and people are more sensitive to different, people in general are, but there's again different extents of it. So there have been studies a little bit, but it's more difficult to do.
And one of the challenges when you start to bring in neuro methods specifically is that you have to have a time point when the thought is occurring, and it has to be a really clear time point. So when you're talking about an auditory narrative, there's a long process of understanding that's happening. Whereas when a snapshot of a picture comes up, and in most cases we're talking about interpersonal harm or inter-character harm or inter-animal harm, I guess, in some of these. But you're talking about a scenario
harm.
where you can lock to within 10 milliseconds when they're actually looking at this, when they're starting the process of thinking, and then you can map that process, because a second in brain processing is a long time. And a second is what it just took me to say a second. So if you think about it in that way, we've moved far beyond the actual moral processing by the time that we could ever figure out what's going on in the brain. So the methods partially limit the extent to which we can go into other things than visual processing of what's going on.
I just want you to read novels to little kids. Man. I mean, so I have just two more things. To me, like, intersectionality is something that we talk a lot about, and it feels to me that your studies are a psychological version of intersectionality, where there's the biological, evolution is a word that's used a lot, social, cultural. Can you talk about this? Because it feels like there are lots of different threads, and how do they braid, how do they not? So, yeah, can you say more about that?
Yeah, sure.
Is that an accurate
yeah,
thing to say?
I would love to think that our work is intersectionality of different types of research. And when we think about the word culture, for example, we tend to think about a lot of arts and music and great things, but then really we need a culture to think about biological adaptations to the environments and the evolution of humans. We needed a culture to be where we are at. So thinking about evolutions, thinking about the history, thinking about biological responses, thinking about genetics, thinking about neural responses, there's a lot of different ways to think about human behavior and psychology, and putting it all together, we're really complex, kind of messy animals to study. But that's the fun part of doing research and thinking about more like basic everyday things, like parents talking to their children and trying to get into more deeper questions about how evolution works. And I think that's really fun.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's actually part of what drew me at least towards psychology, if we're going to call it just the psych field, is that modern day psychology is not necessarily just the clinician on the couch as we would think in historic ways of a Freudian approach. It is understanding human behavior by understanding biological aspects like genetics and the brain and your physiological responses like your sweat and your heart rate variability, as they're going to impact your emotional expression, your cognitive expression, as culture is going to change all of this. And so it does combine so many different fields with the idea that you're studying humans and you're trying to understand why we do what we do and think what we think. So it necessarily combines so many fields.
Yeah. So the last question I have then is, in reading your work, like there's a very, I love the format of all of this, like the method, discussion, you have headings for this. I really appreciate that, because I needed some hand-holding. But it's clear that you're joining ongoing discussions. You're picking up on, as I guess all good research does, right? So what's next for, like in the best world, where do you see yourself going next? What are the questions that you want to answer? And the more fantastic, I guess, the better.
I mean, the first step is what our entire grant is about. So you heard the hints of what our grant is about, and we've been talking about it, but it's about how parental socialization and the way that parents are talking about these moral scenarios will impact kids' neural processing. So that will be our first big step, is to actually figure out, does it impact gut reaction, or does it impact, like we think it will, that longer term, more thoughtful processing that's happening? And then the next step is, well, what happens if we change that? What happens if we intervene and try to have one culture do something that's not normal for their culture and have parents speak in a different way? Does it impact the kids? Does it change their moral behaviors? So I think the next step in some ways is really intervention using neural methods.
Interesting. Sawa, how about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree completely. I think we really want to do the precise mapping between the elements of socializations and cultures and talks and narratives and those events, but also the exact cognitive changes happening in children, because there's a lot of studies done in this area, a lot of studies done in other area, but we are really wanting to the intersectional and connecting between different kinds of fields together and understand this development.
Well, Sawa, Jason, I really appreciate you both taking the time. This was a lot of fun. I have so many more questions that I could go through, but thanks for taking the time and sharing what you did.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
It's
thank you
really
so much.
fun.
This was a great
Absolutely.
experience.
So if you liked what you heard tonight, we will soon announce the next slate of No Reservations guests. You can access No Reservations series at the Weidner Center's YouTube page and at causeeffect.org, and that's CAHSS effect.org. And again, I'd just like to thank everybody from the Weidner Center for their support, for my collaborator, Ryan Martin, who really puts most of this together in a really fantastic way. And if you're out there, thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. Have a good night.